You're finally awake. You were trying to cross the border, right? Walked right into that Imperial ambush, same as us. And that thief over there.
Damn you Stormcloaks. Skyrim was fine until you came along. Empire was nice and lazy.
Skyrim. It's a game I'm positive you've all heard of and played a dozen times by now. The fifth installment in the Elder Scrolls series and arguably Bethesda's most successful, or at least most recognizable, game ever. After the game was released, it sold over 7 million copies in its first week, and has sold a cumulative 60 million copies since then, making it the 7th most sold game in history according to my very thorough research. It's undeniably one of the most popular games of all time, and it's definitely left its mark on the history of gaming. Hell, there are already dozens upon dozens of videos diving into and dissecting Skyrim, uploaded by people who felt passionate about the game, myself included with the creation of this video. Despite Skyrim's success though, a common opinion I've seen in a few places is that Skyrim somehow isn't good or is unplayable without mods. Now, to these people's credit, the game certainly does have a whole laundry list of problems. I mean, the dungeons are repetitive and boring, the melee combat isn't the greatest, magic just completely sucks, most of the characters are barely characters at all, the story lacks nuance, the Civil War questline is full of wasted potential, there's tons of bugs and glitches, and the graphics are a bit dated by today's standards. But even so, I think there's more to this game than most people give it credit for. Unfortunately, this video won't really be talking about or focusing on Skyrim's story and its failures, but if you'd like a more in-depth look at them, then I highly recommend Private Sessions' channel, as they have two really good and very in-depth videos that go over not just the game's story, but also many other things. Or, if you'd like something a little more digestible, then a channel by the name of Duke of Wales also has two videos talking about Skyrim's main quest line, as well as the main quests for the Dawnguard DLC. Both of these channels have done way better than I ever could when it comes to dissecting Skyrim's story, so I'll link their videos in the description. Back to what I was saying before though, with all of the problems I listed in mind, I can understand why people would think the game is not worth playing without mods. But, seeing as how I have over 450 hours in unmodded Skyrim, I feel confident in quoting Todd Howard when I say that it just works. But really, on a more serious note, the idea that Skyrim is somehow completely unplayable without a whole laundry list of mods is, in my opinion, ridiculous, and I'd like to use this video to explain why. Before we can really get into why I think the game is good though, we first have to understand why these people feel this way in the first place. In other words, we need to understand why Skyrim is a bad game. It's not controversial to say that Skyrim has a lot of problems. The ones I mentioned just earlier are barely even the tip of the iceberg, really. But instead of just vaguely pointing out a few dozen bugs, I'd like to use this segment of the video to talk more in depth about some of Skyrim's larger problems. Namely, I'd like to discuss Skyrim's over-reliance on fast travel, its less than stellar combat, and how Skyrim fails at even being a role-playing game. All three of these issues could have videos of their own if I went fully in depth with them, so I hope you can understand that I may summarize things just slightly. Now, let's actually get started and talk about fast travel. Well, I say let's get started, but where do you even begin with something like this? The fast travel system is so broken that it's hard to even put into words. I mean, is something even really broken if it's working as intended? It's like if you tried to build a car from scratch using only rusty and broken parts. Sure, you'd still have a car at the end, but it's been optimized to work as poorly as possible, and you can't expect it to suddenly work perfectly if you only replace the rusty engine with a new, shinier one. Even if you have a new fancy engine, the rest of the car is still complete garbage and isn't fit to be used. What I'm trying to get at is that you can't just change one or two things about the fast travel system and expect it to work perfectly. You'd have to start over from the very beginning, at the very least, if you want it to work well. Before I get too distracted, though, I'd really like to start this section off by talking about the map itself. I don't think it's unfair to say that Skyrim is a pretty big game, not just in the amount of content it offers, but also the sheer size of the map. I've played through Skyrim at least 5 times, and never once have I run into any invisible walls keeping me from going somewhere. That's not to say that they don't exist, of course, but the likelihood of running into one in a normal playthrough is basically zero. You know what Skyrim does have a lot of, though? Mountains. Regardless of what direction you walk in, you're bound to run into a mountain sooner rather than later, and unless you're on one of Skyrim's predetermined pathways, you either have to try and awkwardly climb up the side of the mountain, or take a massive detour until you get around it. Both options are really annoying, especially when you're given the option to completely ignore this issue by fast traveling past the mountain. Let's take the travel to Ivarstead, for example. After killing Myrmilnir and hearing the Greybeard's summon, Jarl Bulgruff sends you off to Iverstead to climb the 7,000 steps and meet with the Greybeards. After all, no one
There's no
ignores the
refusing
Greybeard
the
summoning.
summons of the Greybeards.
The only problem? The massive mountain you'll soon be climbing is currently serving as an obstacle between you and the fastest path to Iverstead. If this were any other mountain, you might be able to climb it, but it's so tall that doing this would be an even bigger waste of time than it normally is. Since scaling it isn't really an option, you might instead try and go around it, but the path is so long that if you're anything like me, you're more likely to just go from the Whiterun stables to the Riften stables before walking in a straight line to Iverstead. Honestly, I don't think I'd ever even walked on the actual path to Iverstead until I did it just so I could gather footage for this segment. And you know what? I really enjoyed it. Maybe it's because the walk to Iverstead is supposed to be one of the first things you do, and the devs still cared about presentation at that point, but the walk to Iverstead is full of all sorts of beautiful and diverse scenery. Granted, the graphics are a bit dated by today's standards, but even still, I found myself having to stop and just take in the views a few times. Take this spot, for example. I mean, just look at it. The sun was just barely peeking over the throat of the world, the calm river flowing beneath my feet, and the trees bathed in a stunning orange glow. I don't even know what to call it other than beautiful, and it's a shame that the average player doesn't see this kind of thing, because they're just fast traveling everywhere. It wasn't only pretty though, but it also felt rewarding. Though it isn't much, having to check the signs as you pass them, and make sure you're still going down the correct path feels more rewarding than just fast traveling as close as you can, and then running the short distance that's left between you and your destination. And that's especially true of the walk to Iverstead. As you finally finish the long run to the small village, you're immediately overwhelmed by the sheer size of the mountain as it looms over Iverstead. Imagine a first-time player seeing the sheer size of the mountain and realizing that they're soon going to be climbing up it in just a few moments. Not only does it seem imposing, but it's also exciting as well. In my opinion, this is the personification of the "see that mountain? You can climb it" joke. But because Skyrim makes fast travel so quick and easy, all of this is completely missed if you don't take the intended path in a game that's all about letting you choose your own path. It's not like this is the only time this issue occurs either, because fast travel is available to the player from the moment you get out of Helgen, which means you're bound to miss out on a ton of what Skyrim has to offer. But at the same time, why wouldn't you use it? Dare I say, the entire map was built with the idea that the player would choose to fast travel instead of walking. Why spend 30 minutes mindlessly walking to your destination when you could be there in a second by fast traveling? Really, I think that's the main issue. The game gives you no incentive to walk instead of fast traveling everywhere. It's quick, it's easy, and there's no consequence or even a chance of consequences for doing it, which ultimately means that you're only wasting your own time if you aren't fast traveling. If you could only fast travel by going to the stables of the major cities, I honestly think that'd be a better system than what they have now. Sure, you could still jump across the map if you wanted to, but if you need to be somewhere that isn't super close to a major city, then it would force you to actually interact with the land of Skyrim. As I said before though, just changing a few parts wouldn't actually fix the whole problem. Not properly, at least. Another problem with fast travel, besides all the content you're missing out on, is the sheer amount of loading screens it'll force you into. Loading screens are already a problem with Skyrim as a whole, but the issue is only exacerbated when fast traveling is factored in. Regardless of how good your PC is, you're bound to spend at least a moment or two in every loading screen, which wouldn't be so bad if they weren't so common. Take the quest Pieces of the Past, for example. Before you even begin the quest, you have to travel to Dawnstar, a city that the game never has you travel to in the main quest line, so if you don't do a ton of exploring beforehand, then you're unlikely to have ever even been there. Since you've never been there, you either fast travel somewhere nearby and walk the rest of the way, or you do what I did and fast travel to some nearby stables and have the carriage take you there. Even if you had been to Dawnstar previously though, it's not like it fixes anything, since you'll still need to fast travel to get there. So that's immediately 1 to 2 loading screens you've gone through just to even get to the city where the quest is located. After that, you'll meet with Silas in his house museum thing, which of course you'll have to go through a loading screen to get into, and after a brief conversation, he'll ask you to gather the missing pieces of Mehrunes' razor. And, of course, they're all really far away and spread out from one another, which would make it a hassle to walk to every single one of them. So unless you actively avoid fast traveling, you're bound to do it around 5 times after the quest is really started. Once to travel to Morthal for the hilt, once to travel to Dead Crone Rock for the pommel, another to go to Cracktusk Keep for the blade shards, once to get back to Dawnstar and give the items to Silas, and one last time to travel to the Shrine of Mehrunes Dagon. And that's excluding the 2 to 3 loading screens you'd go through just to start the quest. Now, luckily enough, this isn't an issue with too many of the side quests, since most of them don't require you to move around that much, but the map is still so large that if you want to get anywhere, you're incentivized to go through a loading screen to get there. And once you factor in how often the average person is fast traveling, The loading screens can become very obnoxious very quickly. There's obviously more issues that I haven't brought up yet, but there's still two other major problems with the game that I want to talk about, and I don't want this video to just be 3 hours of me complaining about fast travel. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the game's combat. If you want to be as vague as possible, Skyrim's combat can largely be divided into two categories, magical and non-magical. Granted, there is a bit of overlap between these categories, but we can just ignore that. For now, I'd like to specifically talk about the magical aspects of Skyrim's combat. There is just one issue though. When I first started writing this part of the script, I realized that I didn't actually remember what it was like playing as a mage in Skyrim, so I quickly ran through the first few hours of the game again as a mage with a focus on destruction spells. I'd like you to keep in mind that I only played up to level 10 though, so some of my criticisms may become moot at later levels. Either way, after playing as a mage for a while, I'd noticed three main problems with the magic in Skyrim. The first being the magicka regeneration rate. Without any enchantments to boost it, your magicka regeneration rate is fixed at 1% of your max per second in combat, which is not great, to say the least. And while there are enchantments to improve this, unless you're breaking the game, you really aren't going to notice the difference. While slow magicka regeneration during combat isn't necessarily a bad thing, it becomes pretty obnoxious when you consider the ridiculous magicka costs for even the simplest of spells. This is the second issue I had while playing as a mage. Even at level 10 with 250 magicka, I can only dual cast an apprentice level spell, which is the second weakest type I might add, 7 times before being completely drained of my magicka and needing to wait for it to regenerate. Granted, dual casting it 7 times is more than enough for a lot of the combat you'll end up in, but it's also not uncommon for you to either run into a large group of enemies that end up draining your magicka, or you'll end up fighting one tougher enemy that takes more than 7 shots to take down. At that point, you'll either have to chug every magicka potion you have, or run and hide for a minute or two and wait for your magicka to regenerate, just so you can rinse and repeat until the enemy is dead. Keep in mind, the character I'd used to beat the main questline of the base game, as well as the main questlines of the Dawnguard and Solstheim DLC, is level 30, so my mage character is essentially 1/3 of the way to killing Alduin, killing the legendary vampire, and killing the first Dragonborn, and yet they can barely cast an apprentice level spell before having to run and hide for 5 minutes. It's not like using novice level spells is a whole lot better either, especially when you're dealing with stronger enemies, because you either end up sitting still, moving side to side, or walking backwards in a straight line while holding down the left and right mouse button. And while this is effective, I think it should go without saying that it isn't very fun. And all of this is only made worse by the agonizingly slow level ups a mage can get in Skyrim. Unless you're enchanting your own armor and wearing that, the only way to get experience as a mage is to use your magic. Take my sword and shield character for example. They can get experience from their light armor, their one-handed weapon, their shield, and from their bow, along with a few other places that don't really matter as much. My mage character, on the other hand, wears robes, which don't count as armor, and they don't use any weapons other than magic, which basically rules out everything I could gain experience from other than leveling my destruction magic, which makes leveling up as a whole take way longer. If you're actually paying attention, then you might be asking me, why not just use enchanted armor, or use the various kinds of staves to make my life as a mage in Skyrim even slightly more enjoyable? And that is a question I will answer, just not right now. Instead, I'd like to turn my focus to the more physical side of Skyrim's combat for a while. Melee combat gets a ton of flack, and a lot of people don't like it, but honestly I've always found it quite fun. That's not to say it doesn't have problems though, because it most certainly does. For example, there's absolutely no reason for you to carry around more than 2 weapons at a time, and if it weren't for dragons that number would have been 1. Really, you just need whatever weapon you've decided to use a majority of the time, and a bow for when dragons refuse to land, but beyond that there's absolutely no incentive for you to purposefully carry around multiple weapons unless you're planning to sell them. Another common issue that people bring up is that Skyrim's melee combat is shallow or too simple, but this one I don't personally understand. Don't get me wrong, Skyrim's melee combat is certainly limited and leaves a lot to be desired, but I don't think it's quite as shallow as many people try to make it out to be. I'm going to address this more when I actually get around to defending Skyrim, but overall I think the actual issue is that Skyrim is terrified of making you think, so it makes the combat so easy that the player doesn't have to interact with all the options at their disposal if they don't want to. In other words, there's just no incentive, good or bad, for you to be careful and pick your next action wisely. If you've got good armor and a decent amount of health, or just a lot of food and potions, any enemy in the game can be taken down without much trouble, and you'll be rewarded all the same. Because the game doesn't go out of its way to force you to interact with the full scale of its melee combat, it leaves most people feeling like there's still a lot to be desired, and it's not like the difficulty options are any help either. If you play on anything higher than Expert, then the game just becomes completely rigged against you. In Master difficulty, enemies deal 2 times more damage than normal, while only taking half as much damage from you, and Legendary difficulty is even worse. It's just a superficial numbers buff that only serves to make every combat 10 times longer and 100 times less interesting, because the more stacked against you the combat is, the more likely you'll just want to use every exploit and cheap trick you can think of in order to win. Far from fixing things, I think the higher difficulties just put all of the issues with melee combat under a spotlight. Really though, I think that about sums up most of my grievances with the combat, so I think it's about time we move on to one of our next biggest problems. Just a few minutes ago, while I was complaining about my life as a mage, I asked a question. If wearing robes is impractical and magicka runs out constantly, why don't you just wear enchanted armor and use various kinds of staffs to help you? I brushed the question off at the time, but I'd like to answer it now because I think my answer perfectly encapsulates the problem Skyrim has with balancing gameplay and roleplay. This is just my opinion, and some of you may disagree, but I feel like role-playing games ought to be an experience first and a game second. Obviously, that's not to say that the gameplay can get a pass for being subpar in a role-playing game, but if you're giving someone a role to play, then it's your job as a developer to fully immerse them into your world, and I think combat should be an extension of that. The problem with Skyrim is that it constantly forces you to pick between playing the game or playing a character. Wearing enchanted heavy armor as a mage is something that works mechanically in the game, but if your goal is to play a role in this role-playing game, then it wouldn't make much sense if the frail-bodied mage was running around in a full set of dragonbone armor. But because I want to wear robes just like every other mage does in Skyrim, the game punishes me for it by making it take longer to level up and offering you basically zero protection at the same time. It's not like them offering you no protection doesn't make sense or anything, it's just that the zero protection coupled with the non-existent skill tree for you to get experience from makes them frustrating to wear and ruins the experience when you have to come up with an arbitrary reason as to why your mage is suddenly running around in full heavy armor just so you aren't having an awful time. Only amplifying the awful roleplay possibilities is the fact that your character has basically no agency throughout the entire game, not only in the dialogue options you have to choose from, but also in the actions you can take as a player. When visiting a bandit camp, for example, you're not able to try and talk to them, maybe strike some sort of deal with the chieftain for safe passage, or intimidate them into letting you by. Instead, the only choice you get to make is which weapon you want to slaughter all the bandits with. No chance for dialogue, just straight to violence. Throughout almost the entire game, the Dragonborn is treated as an object used to enact violence rather than a living person. A living natural disaster, if you will, who's just aimed at different people depending on the quest you're doing. Even in the main story, only 2 times come to mind as I'm writing the script, where the game even attempts to treat you as anything more than a murder hobo, that being the Diplomatic Immunity quest, where you sneak into the Thalmor Embassy, and the Season Unending quest, where you hold the peace talk so you can capture Odahviing in Whiterun. Both quests make an attempt to let the player be more than a violence-hungry psychopath, but neither do a very good job of it. Starting first with Diplomatic Immunity, it seems clear to me that they wanted this to be a more stealthy mission, akin to something like a level in Hitman. By telling you to bring only the absolute essentials with you to the embassy, it's the game's intention to limit your combat options, while encouraging you to go about things a little differently than you normally would. It's certainly a good idea, however it completely falls flat on its face before you even get to the embassy. While the game does ask you nicely to only take your most important items, it also just lets you give Melbourne all of your items without limit, so running through and killing every Thalmor is incredibly easy. Moreover, this is the only quest in the game that tries to do something like this, so if you've already done a handful of other quests before this one, then you've already been conditioned by the game to kill first and ask questions later. If there were more quests like this scattered around Skyrim, not only would it allow you to do more than just single-mindedly kill whatever you come into contact with, but it would also help the player realize that maybe they shouldn't just run in guns blazing. Something else that would have also seriously helped this quest was if there was a weight limit to the items that Malborn could carry. Giving him a maximum weight limit of around, let's say 100 or so, I think would have been perfect. Just enough to sneak in some armor and maybe a weapon or two, along with a couple potions, but not much beyond that. But because Skyrim is terrified of committing to anything, they just let you take all of your stuff with you if you want. Well, to be fair to the game, my suggestions don't matter much anyway, since the stealth is completely broken and doesn't work at all. And even if it did work, it's not like it would have mattered much, since there really aren't any repercussions if you just want to run around and kill everyone. Really, it feels like the devs had good ideas, but were either too scared to fully commit to any of them, or just didn't have enough time to, which left this quest as the half-baked mess that it is. The Season Unending quest is also bad, but for slightly different reasons that tie into the last point I'd like to make in this section. That being that there just aren't any consequences or benefits to choosing one dialogue option over another, and nothing really changes regardless of what option you pick. The biggest problem with the peace talk is that it just doesn't matter. I mean, I guess it acts as a character building moment for the Dragonborn, and lets you think about which side, if any, you'd like to favor in the war, but even then it does a pretty mediocre job of it. If you're trying to play an actual character instead of just running through the game and you end up at the peace talk, it likely means that you're wanting to remain neutral in the war anyway, but even if you're not and you end up favoring one side over the other, it does absolutely nothing for you in the long run. Even if you start the Civil War quest after defeating Alduin, neither General Tullius or Ulfric will ever bring up the choices you made at the peace talk, and nothing about the questline itself will change either. To make matters worse, the peace talk is one of the only times you're given any impactful dialogue options that could actually have an effect on the world, and it still ends up being pointless, which ultimately solidifies the idea that you, the player, don't have any agency. Outside of the main questline, nothing you do really matters, and Skyrim barely even tries to pretend that it does. Something that could have really given the Dragonborn's actions some weight is if there were genuine consequences to not doing a quest in a timely manner. Take the quest to clear out Kolskager Mine, for example. Let's say you hear that the mine has been taken over by the Forsworn, but instead of clearing it out right away, you end up doing some other quests first. And maybe once you come back, you find out that they tried to clear out the mine without you, which led several men to their deaths. It really isn't much, but I think it would still do a much better job than Skyrim currently does at making the choices you make have weight. Another thing that isn't great is the fact that most dialogue options in the game are questions, which isn't inherently bad, I guess, but it certainly isn't doing Skyrim any favors. You're never able to offer any ideas or suggestions to other people which might affect how the quest plays out or anything. You're just railroaded into doing exactly what you're expected to do without any kind of wiggle room. I think this sort of thing is most obvious once the Blades are properly introduced, and you get to meet Delphine. You're told that the Blades are a group of dragon slayers who follow the Dragonborn, but from the very beginning, Delphine is treated as the leader. She never asks for your input, you can't order her around, and anytime you try to question her, she brushes it off. It gets so bad that she even kicks you out of the Blades if you don't kill Parthenax. Let me say that again in case you don't understand. Delphine, a member of the Blades who are supposed to be loyal to the Dragonborn, kicks the Dragonborn out of the organization. And what can the Dragonborn say in response? Nothing. Like, literally, you don't get the option to say anything at all. The developers just put an ellipses as the only dialogue option and called it a day. If you can't see why that's an incredibly bad and, dare I say, lazy thing to do, then I fear you might already be a lost cause. At this point in the video, you might have already asked yourself, wasn't this video supposed to be about why Skyrim is good? And I'm here to tell you that yes, this is a video about defending Skyrim, which I will finally get around to doing right now. I'm not going to try and explain why the problems I've talked about up until now aren't actually problems or anything, since they definitely are, but I would like to talk about a few reasons why I think Skyrim is worth coming back to in spite of its glaring issues. More specifically, I'd like to talk about the variety that the game offers you during combat, the game's overall atmosphere, and the world of Skyrim itself. Starting first with the game's variety in combat, you might remember when I was talking about the problems of Skyrim's combat, that I said that rather than having a problem with the combat itself, I think most people actually have a problem with the game's difficulty. The game is over a decade old at this point, so I think we should cut it a little slack, but the fact still remains that the game doesn't actually have proper difficulty settings. Regardless of the game's lack of challenge options, though, I think the actual combat itself is good if you just choose to interact with it a little more than you're actually forced to. Sure, you could just mindlessly swing at the enemy until they're dead, but at that point, are you not just robbing yourself of the enjoyment you could be having just by putting in a bit more effort? I know the stereotype with Skyrim players is that everything leads back to being a sneak archer, but if you genuinely branch out, try different weapons, and allow yourself to experience different playstyles that the weapon might require, it's a lot more fun than just mindlessly swinging your weapon around. Now, I can't remember every character I've played as, but I do remember a few. Namely, a destruction mage, a stealthy assassin who used a dagger, and 3 warrior-type characters who all had a somewhat different kit. All of my playthroughs with these characters were different because I made the choice to actually think about my actions instead of just mindlessly hitting the attack button over and over again. To illustrate my point further, let's do a little thought experiment. We'll say that you've been playing the game as an Argonian who's wearing light armor and uses a sword and shield. You're raiding a dungeon right now, and after a somewhat difficult fight just prior, you've now found yourself in a bit of a pickle, as you've alerted some Draugr. With that little scene in mind, what's your next move? If you said something along the lines of, open the menu and chug food and potions until I'm back at full HP and fight the Draugr, then congratulations! You're actively giving yourself a worse experience. While it's important to keep in mind that there's really no right answer to my hypothetical, here's what I would have done. Since I'm an Argonian, I'd use the racial ability Hist Skin to quickly regenerate all of my health. Immediately after activating Hist Skin, I'd then switch to a shout. Which shout I'd use is dependent on how far away the Draugr are. If they're still far away, then I'd choose one to deal some damage before they reach me, like Fire Breath for example. That way I have the upper hand once they close the distance. Or if they're too close already, I'd switch to Unrelenting Force to get them off of me, which would give me some time to properly heal before I go in for the kill. And why just swing my weapon around when I can have a bit more pizzazz? Maybe cover your sword in poison, perhaps use one that'll paralyze the Draugr, or one that'll just deal a bit of extra damage. And if the Draugr does manage to get up before you kill it, then you could shield bash for another brief but effective stun that'd help you get some more hits in before it's even hit you once. Now, is either answer to this hypothetical wrong necessarily? Not at all, obviously. However, to me at least, it seems like it would be a bit silly to complain about the lack of depth in Skyrim's combat when you actively refuse to engage with any of it. I mean, you've got access to dozens of poisons, a small handful of different weapon types with their own differences in swing speed and damage, a million different unique shouts, all kinds of enchantments for your weapon and armor both, and a very extensive list of supporting magic you could be using, but you choose to use almost none of it. Now, am I saying that it's your fault that the game doesn't force you to use any of this and just lets you turn your brain off? No. And I'm not saying that the game's combat can't be improved upon by mods either. The only point I want to make is that the combat is better than most people give it credit for, and it's actually quite fun so long as you just don't shut your brain off. More than the variety of ways you can fillet your enemies, though, I find that I enjoy the game's atmosphere almost above all else, and I don't think that should really be a surprise. Skyboxes, for one, have always been something that Bethesda have been proud of.
But I equate it to that moment of we said about listening to the wind go and watching the sunset. And I do think there's a certain beauty to landing on a strange planet, being somewhat the only person there, building an outpost. And we are modeling all of the systems because that's how we like to do things. So you can watch whatever that gas giant or moon, it will rotate and go and sunrise, sunset, and all of those things that you would expect. And it's all really happening.
And I think that really shows in Skyrim. From the star-filled night skies to the cloud-filled rainy days, while playing this game I would often find myself just looking up at the night sky and taking it all in. To help illustrate my point, I want you to now close your eyes and picture a scene for me. You're walking around Skyrim for one reason or another. You aren't paying much attention, but something catches your eye. You look up into the dark, cloudy skies of Skyrim and see the aurora. This beautiful river of green and blue light softly swimming through the night sky above you. It's mesmerizing. But that's hardly all. Spurred on by the lights dancing in the sky, you decide to really take a look around yourself. You're on a small bridge. Underneath you is a lazy river, which leads into a small waterfall. The sound of the water is nice, calming even. The scene you found yourself in is almost like a painting, serene and beautiful. You want so badly to stay here for a while and just take it all in. But you continue forward anyway. Now, more aware of your surroundings, you take a keen interest in the world around you, and, almost as if on cue, you begin to hear those gentle instruments play in the background. You notice the trees, the rocks, and the bushes, all normally mundane, but here and now you can't help but feel like Skyrim is alive, that the world doesn't just exist for you. A little further up the path, you end up scaring a goat, which runs down the road ahead of you. Running away is something most animals do in Skyrim, but the way this goat sticks to the path and stays just out of reach, you'd almost think that it was encouraging you to keep moving forward. As you come up to the top of the hill you've been climbing, you find yourself staring down another mountain just up ahead. A thick fog rolls down its sides, slowly revealing Skyhaven Temple, the home of the Blades. Okay, end of the story. It's almost surreal how Skyrim can suck you in like that, turning a mundane walking trip into a moment I won't be forgetting anytime soon. Now, this was all spurred on by the noticing of the stellar skybox, but you should also notice that the aurora was only a small part of that whole scene. That's because skyboxes themselves only really take up about a third of the game's atmosphere. They're certainly pretty, but if a nice-looking skybox was all Skyrim had to offer, then this part of the video wouldn't even exist. No. If you were paying attention, then you probably noticed the other two things I brought up in the scene. Namely, the sound design and Skyrim's environment. I believe these make up the remaining 2/3 of Skyrim's atmosphere. The sound design in Skyrim isn't something most people think about, and that's a good thing, I think. Much like music and movies, I think the sound design serves to enhance the experience without drawing your attention away from what really matters. I wholeheartedly believe that the sound design in Skyrim is the most important thing that really draws the player in. The sound of heavy rain hitting the ground, thunder rumbling in the distance, your feet hitting the ground, the heavy breathing as you run out of stamina, the sound your weapon makes as you sheath and unsheath it. None of these things are very important in the grand scheme of things, but my god, do they really get you absorbed in the game. Among the things I just mentioned, I think the sound of your feet against the ground is my favorite. It's such a minute detail, but it adds so much character. The way your steps will be heavier if you're wearing heavier armor, or lighter if you're wearing robes, was an admittedly unnecessary detail, but one that I enjoy very much. It's soothing almost, to just let the game world exist around you, to be absorbed into it. When I went back to look at some of my footage for this part of the script, I actually noticed the sound of birds and crickets chirping in the background, which I'd never even noticed before, but I'm genuinely so glad I was able to take the time to appreciate it. Honestly, I'm at a bit of a loss for words to really even describe why I like it so much, but at the end of the day, I think these little sounds add so much to Skyrim as an experience, and the game would have absolutely been worse off had it not included them. Beyond just the game's sounds, though, there's also the game's environments. I touched on the world very briefly when I was talking about fast travel, but Skyrim has some seriously beautiful scenery if you just look around a bit. For example, the dozens of waterfalls all scattered throughout Skyrim. Because of all of the mountains, you can really find them all over the place, but them being common never made them any less fun to observe. There's no two that are exactly the same, which means each one will have something new to offer you. Granted, I do have an appreciation for nature that a lot of people don't, but when I see all of these waterfalls, I can't help but to just stop and stare at them. Nature in general has always been something that captivated me in a way that nothing else ever can. There's not really a good way to put it into words, but seeing a large tree sway in the wind, or a colony of ants move about their business has always drawn my attention far more than anything else. Hell, ever since last year I got into the habit of finding a spider and just staring at it for a while, maybe 20 to 30 minutes at most. No music, no talking, just silent watching. I know that sounds weird, and quite frankly I will fully admit that it is, but just being able to be absorbed in the moment as I watch the spider do usually nothing is relaxing to me. All that is to say, I'm a big fan of nature, and although Skyrim doesn't always manage to capture the full scale of nature's beauty, I think the waterfalls are one area where they excel. Of course, a big part of the enjoyment I get from them is the sounds they make, but even without that, they're still a lot of fun to just look at. If waterfalls aren't your thing though, there's still plenty more to see around the world, from tall, domineering mountains and the woods that lay in between them, to the interesting architecture and ruins that are scattered throughout Skyrim's land. Truly, there's something for everyone. Though I honestly don't think that just telling you why these things are good will help illustrate my point very much, so instead I'll just show you. Moving on from the lush trees and captivating waterfalls, though, I'd like to instead bring your focus on the finer details that Skyrim has to offer. When it comes to the world that Bethesda has crafted, there's an undeniable substance to it that draws people in, and I think that Skyrim being one of the most modded games in history is proof of that. More than just the pretty scenery or the variety of ways you can kill a man, people want to see more of what the world has to offer. Is the game perfect or even put together that well? Maybe not, but the fact still remains that millions of people fell in love with what Skyrim had to offer in spite of all of its shortcomings. From the ancient history of the dragons and the brave Nords who sought to topple their empire, to the history of the Falmer and the Dwemer, the game is dripping with mystery and intrigue for people to explore. Want to know the history of the Empire? Luckily for you, there's an entire quadrilogy of books going over that exact thing. Want to learn about the history of the Blades? There's a book for that too. Want to learn about what it's like in a tomb when you aren't raiding it? You guessed it, there's a book for that too. The people who worked on this game clearly put a lot of love and care into it when designing everything, and I think that's something that a majority of people can pick up on. An excellent example of this effort is the Falmer. Compared to most of the other enemies you face in Skyrim, the Falmer stands out both in design and lore. The first time you're probably going to meet them is when you're running through a Dwemer ruin, whose main enemies are typically the Dwarven Spheres and the Dwarven Spiders. Creatures which are largely meant to act as defenders against intruders, but as you descend deeper into the ruins of the ancient civilization, you'll find yourself fighting a new enemy, far from the undead Draugr, the living bandits, or the mechanical creations you're probably accustomed to fighting by now. These creatures are unlike anything you've seen up until now. They're gross little things that are seemingly permanently hunched over, with ghostly pale skin and a distinct lack of eyes. Unlike the other species that all use regular metal, the Falmer instead seem to have opted to use the chitinous shell of the Chaurus, which they fashioned into weapons and armor, which only makes them stand out even more. Only making things even more odd are all the tents and the occasional Chaurus farms you'll find, which suggests that whatever these things are, they've been living here for a while. And that's basically all you're ever forced to learn about them. The game has no problem with just letting you know nothing about them. But for those more interested in the Falmer's lore, they'll find a lot more than what they bargained for. And this is true for just about every major group and location in Skyrim. Regardless of where you look, you're bound to find a rich history that's been carefully crafted by people who clearly cared about the world of Skyrim. And if you're like me and don't really care to find the lore in-game, then there's literally hundreds of videos talking about the various parts of Skyrim's lore for you to watch and listen to. I mean, one of the first videos I found was only talking about the history of the Nords, and it's nearly 5 hours long. If talking about just a single of the 10 races in Skyrim takes 5 hours, then I can only imagine how long it'd take to talk about the other 9. But the fact that it would take so long is, in my opinion at least, great evidence for the extreme care and careful craftsmanship that went into the lore of this world, and it's for these reasons that I think so many people fall in love with the world of Skyrim.
I love Skyrim. I don't know, I know it's like, it's janky, and it's not the best written game. And the puzzles are not even the best, but even the quests are not always the best, but there's just something about it that's so good. It's such a fun game.
But yeah, that's really all I wanted to say in this video, and even if you don't agree with what I've said, I still hope you can understand my point of view. Skyrim's just a wonderful game, and I don't think it deserves most of the hate that it's gotten in recent years. This video definitely could have been better. There's still a million things that I haven't talked about, and a few of the sections in the script could have stood to be a bit longer, but honestly I got a bit tired of working on it, and I still mostly got my point across, so it's probably fine. The part where I talked about the game's atmosphere in particular is one I would have liked to expand on, but my ignorance in the subject of things like sound design ultimately left me with a very limited way of expressing why I think it's as good as it is. Despite these challenges though, I hope I was still able to get all of my points across thoroughly. You can probably also expect more content like this in the future, but at the same time I'm going to play around and toy with the videos I make for a bit, just to see what I do and don't like. Actually, the next video I have in mind is going to be one of these experimental types, so I'm hoping you guys will be into it because I think it'll be fun. Anyways though, I think this video is already long enough, and I don't want to keep you any longer, so thank you for watching and see you later, hopefully.